Stop me if you've heard this before. A piece of criticism that I used to see, which could still be common but I don't pay attention, with FE6 and FE7 was that they were much simpler and quote-unquote watered down versions of the original developer of the series, Shozo Kaga's most ambitious games in FE4 and FE5. In these kinds of conversations, FE6 would be pushed aside because most agree that FE6 was even less mechanically complex than FE7, but new players to the series didn't even know FE6 came before it. So the only reference they had was this one. It's true though. 3CS776 had a ton of mechanics on display and under the hood. It was a much more difficult and complex game than any of the GBA era by a long shot, and the reputation of FE-GBA being dumbed down for Western audiences was technically true, but a statement like that takes away from the nuance and experimentation that this game actually had. All Fire Emblem games are ambitious, trying new things that specifically benefit their game, trying things that sound cool, or just trying new ideas out to refine them for another game. Blazing Sword is exploratory in its own right, and quite frankly, IS had a lot of pressure on their shoulders not to blunder the first impression of the series for Western fans, and came up with a handful of one-off ideas that worked and were cool, while also introducing the series to ideas that have been staples ever since. This video highlights the decisions made and ideas introduced in Blazing Sword that I think are awesome. Yep, this is a puff piece to celebrate the new year, which even though this video might come out before then, still, I'm going to be breaking 8 ideas up into categories and end things off with an honorable mention section of smaller things that didn't quite fit anywhere else. Let's start with user experience. Lin Mode. This 12-chapter tutorial has had division on whether it was a good or bad idea. A criticism that gets levied at the game is the shoehorned mode on a first playthrough that you need to complete. This is perceived worse when playing FE7 after its release, as people go back to the older games after being introduced to the series by another one, where the player already knows how Fire Emblem works, and Lin Mode forces you through the story mode and grabs your hand and does not let go through the very basics of the game. Veteran Japan players would still need to deal with this, so they probably didn't like it as much, but whatever. In this very specific sense, it didn't age well, but in context, it was a very appropriate decision to include in my opinion. It wasn't like necessary per se, of course, as no previous game had an in-game tutorial and FE6 only had a tutorial chapter. There's a universe out there where we just didn't get Lin Mode at all, but it was incredibly useful to appeal to a generation of adolescent first-time players to a genre that was barely known in the West. And besides, Lin Mode has layers, man. First off, Lin herself was a very appealing character, being a lot of people's first true video game crush for one thing, but having a guide walk you through every single relevant mechanic, user, or combat was helpful, and it was paced along an easy to follow story with likable characters throughout. From trading to the weapon triangle to effective weapons, doors, chests, shops, ballistae, dancers, guidance requirements, class promotions, battle prep, recruiting allies, fog of war, and working through different chapter objectives, this mode prepared you for the true gameplay that was to come. It also rewarded you for completing it on hard mode, taking the guardrails off, like it was New Game Plus or something. Now you had the freedom to not promote Wallace and instead promote Kent, Sane, or nobody, which was a wise idea if you actually wanted to use Wallace in the main story. And you could carry your investment in all these units again when they come up in the main story. Lin Mode did everything it set out to for the new demographic of players. The fact that I'm here talking 20 years later after I played it is a pretty good endorsement of that choice. Let's talk about the literal things in the game. Placeable items. You can't have a conversation on cool ideas in Blazing Sword without talking about the light rune and especially the mine. The light rune was a single-use item that when placed on the map would block off all movement until it disappeared the next turn. It basically predated the obstruct/ice blocks of Engage and the blockades in those 2 paralogs in Fire Emblem Fates. But in this game they couldn't be destroyed. There were 3 total in the game, all carried in the inventories of Legault, Rathan the main story, and Renault. Unfortunately for the light rune, you only had 3 the whole game. It was a great idea that got limited use, returning in Radiant Dawn as the Shine Barrier, but it has still never come back. The mine operated the same, but would detonate when any unit walked on the tile, would deal 10 damage, and stop the unit in their tracks. The mine is associated with the notorious mine glitch, and perhaps was a reason why the mine was not used in FE8. Interestingly, it is in Radiant Dawn, but goes unused. Both of these items allowed the player to interact with enemies in a brand new dimension. They were applying a status to the map tiles themselves. Even without knowledge of the mine glitch, a tactical layer would emerge when you decided to use this scarce resource, and I personally think these items have so much potential, and it's great to see Fire Emblem lean into these items once again. Dancer rings. The Dancer Rings are equipment used by Ninian and Nils to provide unique buffs to allies through the dance command, gave dancers even more utility, and there were 4 Dancer Rings in the game. Ninnis Grace, which increases an ally's defense and resistance by 10 for 1 turn, Set's Litany, which increases a unit's avoid by 10 for 1 turn, Thor's Ire, which increases an ally's critical hit chance by 10% for 1 turn, and Phila's Might, which increases an ally's attack by 10 for 1 turn. As displayed, these were mid to late game items that's effects varied from useful to extremely strong. Ninnis Grace and Phila's Might in particular were immensely powerful, but balanced by their single turn use, 15 durability, and the fact that they came at the cost of refreshing a unit to begin with. The game itself never actually specified what exactly the buffs were, and you had to look them up. What I particularly loved about these items was that they had to be this strong in order to add a relevant mental stack to the player. The thing is, you had to make the choice between bolstering an ally's attack or defenses by 10 or whatever, or refreshing another ally, which in my opinion is fantastic balancing in of itself. One could say these rings were additionally balanced by their mid to late game use and difficulty to acquire, but I just wish they specified exactly what they did in game instead of only giving us flavor text. If they did include specifics, I feel like a lot more people would remember them. I love these rings, and I think they were revolutionary to give dancers an added support role. The echoes of Dancer Rings kind of feels like they exist in other forms like in rally skills now, but even those aren't as holistic as the rings, and I do hope Fire Emblem explores this idea once again. Classes. There are 2 classes that were introduced here that are very memorable for kind of similar reasons. First, let's talk about the Assassin. Yes, a mainstay in the series now, the Assassin started in FE7 with a bang, Jafar, a character who I would argue is still the most synonymous with the class. His part in Blazing Sword's character-driven story embraced this new role in many ways. Our literal first taste of it was Jafar nuking Layla with lethality. And his whole storyline is breaking away from his reputation as the Angel of Death. Assassin and lethality have been in every game since. It is a series staple now, and in my opinion, it's characterized best in its original game. The Magic Seal. This class is the most unique class in the entire franchise, and like Assassin, is directly tied with the story. For those who don't know, or somehow don't remember, the Magic Seal was Kashuna's unique class. He was very simple. He couldn't attack, but possessed the ability to nullify all magic and staves within a 10-tile radius, including that of the enemy. As far as stats go, his strength, skill, luck, and resistance were all basically 0 depending on the mode, but they literally don't matter. He only exists to be a huge detriment to all units on the field while being extremely hard to kill. And in spite of not being able to fight back, is considered one of the hardest bosses in the game. An insane statement made true due to the fact that if you want to unlock the guide in Chapter 19XX, you need to defeat him on the turn you attack him on with only physical units or else he retreats. Story-wise, Kashuna was the first morph Nurgle attempted to give emotions to, but the experiment was a disaster, leaving him with this unique ability instead. It's true that Kashuna, the Magic Seal, could only operate the way he does because it's related to the story directly, but this is another example of Blazing Sword's ambition to fully invest itself in its own writing. Kashuna didn't need to be a Magic Seal. They could have just made him a shaman with the same stats. They didn't even need him to exist in the story to begin with. He's literally optional content hiding behind numerous affectionately obtuse guided unlock requirements. He is such a strong advocate for why FE7's character-driven narrative was so effective. He wasn't just a Magic Seal, he was literally, functionally, a sealer of magic, and the game made sure you knew. Removing Kashuna from the class itself, however, it would be really cool to see its effects come back in another title. Global Silence is a crazy mechanic to work around, and it can certainly be done. Now let's talk about the Gaiden storyline. Fittingly, as we just talked about Kashuna, everyone knows Fire Emblem is a linear game. You go from chapter to chapter uncovering the main story. Everyone also knows that Gaidens or paralogs occur on the side and serve to add character depth and lore. 3 Houses had paralogs for students and staff that taught you more about the world, and Engage's paralogs mostly focused on taking you back to the emblems' most important battles, Lin's notwithstanding. But FE7 took Gaiden to its most extreme. It wasn't just a one-off side story, it was an entire mini arc of chapters documenting different moments of Nurgle's past. They weren't easily available. By design, they were obscure chapter requirements that needed help from a guide to be unlocked, which is for better or worse. What you learned in FE7's side story was that Nurgle had deeply cared for his children, Ninian and Nils, before going mad with power due to the exposure of dark magic, that Kashuna was a failed experiment of his, and once you unlocked all the Gaidens, his death quote would change upon him gaining a sense of clarity before he died. Learning these guidance existed, defeating Kushuna in that short amount of time, in one turn, then being rewarded with more lore and characterization was yet another reason why Nurgle, the Morphs, and Kushuna were so memorable. All those player experiences that go, oh, I got Lloyd instead of Linus, I got Harkin instead of Corel, who is Theodore and how do I get him? These stories would be the talk among fans on forums and message boards. Leave a like down below if you ever pulled out the GameFAQs user-submitted guides to finally get these. Hector Mode. There's a few things about Hector I want to highlight. Number one, he's the first non-sword user at base in the series, and his PRF axe, Wolfbeal, is also the first axe to have rapier properties. Hector Mode genuinely feels like it would have been DLC had FE7 been released today. This companion mode added 2 extra difficulties, Hector Normal and Hector Hard, the latter of which being the hardest one in the game. Partitioning difficulty modes up until the first completion wasn't new at the time, as Roy's Hard Mode did the same thing, but Hector Mode is the first and only one of its kind, a campaign intentionally more complete than the main story from the perspective of another character. Hector Mode was able to happen because he had been alongside Eliwood in his story, but it turns out that shifting perspectives to a guy who was actually secretly dealing with his own emotional trauma without telling anyone so as not to worry them is a pretty good premise. I find it really impressive how Hector Mode's writing maintained that it was Eliwood's story, but with a ton of Hector-specific guidance, and they pulled it off. Honorable mentions. The following features and ideas started in FE7, but I can't really talk about these ones in more than a few sentences because they were just novel ideas and they speak for themselves. Luna, as a tome. Prior to FE7, Luna was a skill. In an effort to bolster the roster of tomes for dark magic from FE6, which only had Flux, Eclipse, Nosferatu, Fenrir, and Apocalypse, FE7 brought in Luna. And holy crap was this overtuned. It was the combination of ignoring res, having a good hit rate, and providing critical hit. This made Canis extremely capable of killing bosses, and including the dragon, whose massive res just didn't matter. This could be further bolstered by Phila's Might, giving him extra attack, or Thor's Ire giving him extra crit. Admittedly, Luna in FE7 is notorious for its immense power, and so it was heavily nerfed in FE8. It had, from then on, never been featured as a tome up until 3 Houses and 3 Hopes, where Luna became a spell. Luna in general stands as a pretty unique idea all things considered now, as it jumps between being a skill and a weapon depending on the game. Using items in the battle prep menu. You would think that being able to promote or use a unit stat booster in battle preparations happened in FE5 or FE6, the game with the same engine as this one, but surprisingly you could not. Future games would include bases and even more things to do in the menus themselves, but Intelligent Systems looked at the clunkiness of FE6's preparations and made one change that streamlined it, and it hasn't turned back since. The self-insert. This video would not be complete without a mention of the self-insert in some form. The truth is, Nintendo insisted that a strategist be included in the game, and in fact, Mark was supposed to leave after Lin Mode. IS was able to make the strategist role in Mark even though it wasn't in their original plans, which makes sense as to why Mark had no major impact on anything. The main characters followed your lead and instructions, sure, but no one is really about to argue that the main story would be completely different without him. But for what it's worth, it didn't take away from the story experience that much, and maybe if anything, did encourage the developers to proceed with Chris and New Mystery, which cascaded into the very relevant mechanic we know of today. And that will do it for the subject of things never before done in Fire Emblem that Fire Emblem Blazing Sword did that I think were pretty freaking cool. I know a lot of my content pokes fun at Fire Emblem, which I can see the irony of. Yes, ideas can flop in any game. Like every Fire Emblem game has an idea that falls flat, but that's only because this is a constantly evolving and highly adaptive series, and I think it's extremely impressive and a large part of why it's still here. Every game brings something new to the table, even if they don't seem that way from a cursory glance. There's so much about this franchise to appreciate, and I hope today I reminded you of some of those things. Anyway, I wish you all a happy new year, and sincerely thank you for a whole year of support. I wonder what 2025 will bring. Maybe a remake of the very game that brought me here to begin with. Maybe in the next 10 years. Anyways, if you're still listening, please leave a like and comment down below your thoughts on the video, whether you agree or disagree with something in it, or whether I got something wrong, like usual. And with that all being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.